Are you surprised the course that Russia has taken? And does Russia always need to be contained?
I'm disappointed in the course that Russia has taken. You know, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, I think we all believed that Russia was poised for democracy. We knew it would be hard. They had a totalitarian past. But if you ask political scientists, what are the best conditions for democracy? They'll say literacy, a high level of industrial development, GDP, and ethnic homogeneity. Now, in terms of and by the way, that the old regime goes away peacefully. So the old regime had gone away peacefully. Gorbachev literally signed away the rights of the Soviet Union, and Russia became Russia. They had a charismatic figure in Yeltsin. They had high levels of industrialization. They had 99.9% literacy. And for the most part, Russia was ethnically homogeneous. Everybody thought all you had to do was unleash all of that brain power. I mean, these were the people who did produce Pushkin and some of the great mathematicians of the time. It turns out that institutions matter more. I don't think it's DNA, by the way. I don't think the Russians are somehow not capable of democracy. But in those first few years, they did a few things that turned out to have been problematic. The shock therapy in the economy, taking an economy that was 99% government-owned, and suddenly 57% of it is private in a matter of 3 years. And the Russian people lose 50% of their earning power in a matter of a year. Boris Yeltsin, first president of Russia, gets bored, gets frustrated with the legislature. He starts ruling by decree. He sends the tanks against the legislature. The executive has to be checked. Executive power has to be checked. Now, that presidency under Boris Yeltsin, which is a powerful presidency, is one thing. But when that presidency is now under Vladimir Putin, it's quite another thing. That then is followed by an assertive foreign policy. And the sad thing about Russia is it's almost always shown its influence in the world through an assertiveness, not through respect from other means.
But do you think Russia always needs to be contained?
Well, it needs to be contained as long as it has this kind of assertive foreign policy, because unfortunately, if you're going to reestablish the Russian people in greatness, I mean, I'll tell you a little story about this. So I'm meeting with Vladimir Putin, and I know him pretty well, and he likes me. Maybe still does, but he liked me at the time because I was a Russianist. And at some point he says, Condi, you know us. Russia has only been great when it's been ruled by great men, like Peter the Great and Alexander the Second. And there's that voice in your head that wants to say, and do you mean Vladimir the Great? But of course, you're Secretary of State, that would be rude. You can't do that. But that's who he thinks he is. He thinks he's reuniting the Russian people in greatness. And the problem is, so what if that means you have to take territory from Ukraine? So what if that means you have to run bomber runs up and down the coast of Sweden? I mean, what have the Swedes done to the Russians in the last 300 years? So what if you have to threaten the Baltic states? And so that Russia has to be contained.
But you say it's not in the Russian DNA. But why so does Russia always need to dominate their neighbors or be in a state of conflict?
It's well put, Joe, because that's exactly what happens. I think that they never take the time to develop the other means because they have this image of themselves as a great power. So, between 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and roughly 1998 or 1999, they're going to do it differently. They're going to be part of the West. Even Gorbachev told me, we're going to be a normal country. And that means we're not going to use coercion and lies with our own people. What we're going to do is we're going to be respected for Russian brain power and our ability to contribute to the international system. And then they find that's really hard. And so they revert to what they do best. Extractive industries, oil and gas, a syndicate that bases its political power, its economic power, its state power on oil and gas, and empire. There's a wonderful little book called The Congress of Vienna by Harold Nicholson. And in it, he describes the first time that the Russian Tsar Alexander I, comes to the concert of Europe, the big post-Napoleonic Wars concert. And this British journalist looks at this figure in the corner. He says, "Who is that?" And he says, the British diplomat said, "Well, that's the Tsar Alexander I, the Tsar of all Russia, the Prince of the Duchy of Muscovy," and the Tsar's title's like this long. So he looks at him again. He's got double-headed eagles and, epaulets, and he says, who is he? He says, "Well, he's Tsar of all Russia, et cetera, et cetera." Finally, the exasperated journalist says, "So why is he here?" And the British diplomat says, "Because his armies are in Paris." To a certain extent, Russia has only been respected when its armies were in Paris. And therein lies the problem. When's the last time you bought a product made in Russia that wasn't based on petroleum? So finding that way back into the system that's not about conquest, not about empire, has been hard for them.
On that note, does Ukraine ever get back Crimea?
It's going to be tough. Look, I don't think we're going to be able to affect it. We can sanction and we can do lots of things, but to be fair, the annexation of Crimea was popular even with some of my liberal Russian friends, because they believe Crimea is Russian. Crimea was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev in 1954 to cement Russian-Ukrainian friendship, but it didn't matter. It was all part of the Soviet Union. And so my liberal Russian friends say, okay, so why didn't they give it back? Right? So he's got some support. But if we don't recognize the incorporation of Crimea, I'm reminded that for 45 years, we did not recognize the forcible incorporation of the Baltic states into the Soviet Union. We couldn't do anything about it, but we didn't recognize it. And when the Baltic states were freed under circumstances that none of us could have foreseen, they've become some of America's best friends. So maybe the thing to do is to stick by the principle.